because this book is a kind of layered methodology. It's sort of, I'm a journalist, so it's a work of journalism to some degree, but it's personal. And it's also a little bit the frustrated PhD I never did, so it's also history. And, people often ask me if it's a family memoir, but as you'll see, it's the unfamily memoir. It's about the life my grandfather didn't choose and the life he ended up choosing, and I investigate the path he didn't take, which sort of led me to become, as many of my countrymen are and women, an accidental American by his choices. As much as my grandfather loved America for what it stood for its freedoms, for what it had done for him, he never seemed of this country. And he stood apart from, or perhaps outside, the town in northwest Massachusetts where he settled and opened a medical practice. His English, though grammatically perfect, had the light lyrical accent of European sophisticates. He would biannually free himself from our idioms entirely for 6 weeks at a time and find his way back to Europe. I'm skipping ahead. Karl's flight from Vienna at age 26, 6 months after the Anschluss, when Hitler swept through the city to throbbing throngs of well-wishers and Jewish students were expelled from schools across the city, their families banished from work in hospitals, shops, parks, daily life, their world upended, was always described to me in similar grand terms: danger, excitement, fulfillment, nothing short of remarkable. Because he actually finished his medical degree before Jews were stripped of the right to finish school. Because he got out at all. And it was complete with a happily ever after ending. The entire family, well, the core of the group, the essentials, got out safely. The story of that escape, and the way I understood it, shaped my childhood imaginings, my nightmares, my dreams. The reality of that escape shaped his worldview. It was some years after his death when my grandmother casually told me she had destroyed my grandfather's personal correspondence. We were setting the table for dinner. They sat in a filing cabinet for 60-something years, she said. I decided that was long enough. We fought about it. They are all in German, she said quietly, derisively. But though I hissed petulantly, it's not a dead language. Really, what was the point? There was no undoing. I saved the important things, she said slyly, like our love letters. Emphasis on our. What was destroyed, I asked. Oh, I don't know. Letters from Shanghai, people you've never met, people who are gone. I'm getting ahead of myself. It was a few years after our argument, and I was rooting around in cabinets in my grandfather's old office beneath his bust of Kurta. There, I came across an old album, the kind with photo corners cradling black and white snapshots with scalloped edges, photographs of formal portraits to informal crowds of laughing European teens and 20-somethings in the late 20s and early 30s. Among these images were dozens of tiny photos of a young woman. Your Volley was written on the back of nearly each one, in a feminine hand I didn't recognize. Here she was laughing next to my grandfather. Here she was mugging, hands on hips. Another showed the two of them lying on a bed, smiling coyly, shot into a mirror. There were photos of him and her in bathing suits, snuggled up close, laughing. They appeared, in the parlance of teenagers, to be more than friends. Tucked into the back of the album, folded into a small, tight square, was a piece of paper pasted with a series of photos the girl named Volley had taken of herself. Each square was numbered 1 through 4. I am so sad, said the first. They are all written in German. I'm still waiting, but no letter from Karl has come yet. Here she makes a serious face, then square 2. Maybe this will help. If not, then not. A photo, a wistful face. She is, I learned later, quoting from a popular song of the turn of the last century, Der eine Line. Square 3. But no, it would be so much nicer if he'd write again, the way he used to, the way I endlessly long for it to be, if only he'd write again at last. Her gaze is now turned away from the camera into the middle distance, but by the 4th she is turned again to the viewer with a big smile. Maybe a letter will come tomorrow. One will surely come, won't it? The little note was dated May 5th, 1939, about 10 months after my grandfather had left Europe. I held the document up and asked my grandmother who the author was. Your grandfather's true love, she said, and offered nothing more. His what? My grandmother was not a terribly romantic woman. What a totally devastating thing to say. I tried to press her on it, but she demurred and retired to her room. She refused to comment further. I feared to ask more. So at this point, I find this note, and I contacted my grandfather's sister, who was part of this Essentials. And really, as a child, I hadn't questioned the story, because when you think about your life as a child, it is your nuclear family. It's your mother and your siblings and maybe your father and but it might not even be your aunts and uncles. It might not even be your grandparents. So when they said they had escaped with everyone and it had been his mother and sister, I didn't question it particularly. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I thought there might have been others, but I didn't think about it seriously until that point. And so I contacted his sister, who was still living, and I said, who was this woman? Who is this Vali, writing to him? And she said her name was Valerie Sheftel. She'd come alone to Vienna from Czechoslovakia to study medicine. And she'd fallen in love with my grandfather immediately, and he had at first ignored her. And then one summer he realized he was in love too, and he ran to tell her, and they had a whirlwind romance, and they planned to escape together. But in the end, he escaped with his mother and sister, the people I knew he'd escaped with. And around that time, she wrote me a note. She typed it and sent it by mail. And she said, find out what happened to her. She was brilliant. I always wondered what happened to her. But at the time I thought, what more can I say, really? I mean, what more is there besides this name, this note, these few small photographs? You know, recently talking about the book, I was at a Yom HaShoah, a Holocaust Day memorial, where at the beginning, for 20 minutes or so, they read names. Name after name after name, and they invited people from the audience to come up and light candles. And I thought, what does a name mean? What does a name mean? What does even this photograph mean, with no biographical detail, with no clues, with nothing to go on? And so I let it sit, in part. And I started reporting smaller stories about the war, about what happened to regular people, what happened to the Sarah Wildmans, if you will. And partly that started here. I was told about a book called Des Camps d'Anvers, which was around 2003, 2004. And these 3 camps, which were in the center of this city, were tasked with sorting and redistributing all of the goods of the Jews deported. 76,000 Jews had things. They had tables and chairs, they had cribs, they had china and cutlery, and armoires and bedding. What happened to it? And the historian who worked on that book, Jean-Marc Dreyfus, and a sociologist named Sarah Wildman, they had found that Jewish slaves were tasked with helping the French moving companies. The French moving companies came and took the things from the apartments and brought them to 3 depots, one in the 10th, one by Austerlitz, and one near the Champs-Élysées. And at those depots, these things that were reusable, the tables and chairs and armoires and cribs, were sent to the Reich, to bomb victims. And everything personal, all those photographs and letters and school papers, the Jews there were told to burn them, to erase those who had been here. And so they knew they were not expected back, that there was more than an extinction as I looked into it. It was around not just about murder, it was about erasing. We think so much about the idea of keeping careful notes, but it was really about erasing individual identities. And so Vali stayed with me too, and I kept thinking about her. How was I contributing to this in some way? Why was I not adhering to this dictum of my great aunt? Why didn't I do something with it? And still I thought, what could I do? And around this time I heard about these archives. When I published that piece about the camps in Paris, the Holocaust Museum contacted me, the one in DC, the big one, and they said there's an archive in the far west of Germany called Bad Arolsen. The town is Bad Arolsen. The archive was the International Tracing Service. It was the collection of everything the Allies had picked up as they liberated town after town and camp after camp. And it was 17.5 miles of material, and no scholar had ever been allowed to look at it. They wanted me to write a story and get the State Department to open it. Would that I were so powerful to be able to write that story that it would have had that effect. But nevertheless, I joined the crew of people anxiously awaiting for these archives to open. Because around the time that the 11 countries which controlled the archives, but from early 1950-ish on, it was controlled by the Red Cross and had to be opened with an agreement of 11 countries. And as we all know, it's very hard to get countries to agree on things. But around 2007 or so, there was an agreement to open them. And it was around that same time that I was poking around in my parents' basement, and I came across a box that they had taken out of my grandparents' house. We had sold my grandparents' home by then. And that box had another box inside of it. It was late at night, I was visiting my parents, and I was idle. midnight maybe, puttering around, and I came across this box labeled Patient Correspondence A through G. My grandfather was a doctor, and I opened it. And it was filled with hundreds and hundreds of letters from his entire exploded Viennese world, from everyone who was not included in that pile of essentials I had always thought were the most important, that they were the only people. And instead, in this box, there were nieces and nephews, there were aunts and uncles, there was a half-brother I had never heard of. And there were dozens and dozens of letters from this woman, Vali Chantel. And I thought, maybe now, if I could go to these archives, and I could also use her letters in some way as a guide, I might be able to retrace her steps and find out what had happened to her. And so I went to these archives with the first group of scholars from the museum in the summer of 2008. And I had this fantasy that I didn't need to yet really deal with the letters because the archive was going to hand me everything I needed in a little manila folder, and it would say, this is everything else that you need, and then put it together and you're done, which is of course not how an archive works. But it did show me two things, which I'll come back to in the end. And one was that someone else had come looking for her before me. It wasn't my grandfather. And I knew this because, let me set the scene. The town of Bad Arolsen is a Baroque, beautiful, perfect German village with a Schloss at the end and a prince named Witteken of Waldeck, whose own godfather was Heinrich Himmler. And just beyond the Baroque city center are SS barracks. And those are filled with pages and pages and pages and pages and pages of material. And then just beyond that, a little further than you can walk comfortably, there's an old NATO driving school. Sort of like an American elementary school of the 50s or 60s. And they're open to the elements that summer at least. On shelf after shelf, the kind of middle shelves people often line their basements with, open to the air, were thousands and thousands and thousands of pages. And the pages were the tracing and documentation files. It was there where they found the note that someone else had come looking for Vali. But they knew that because that entire school was filled with requests for information. Do you have any information about my husband? Did my mother survive? Did my son? Did my daughter? Did my sister? Did my aunt? Is there anyone else from my town still living? Thousands and thousands and thousands of pages asking if people were still alone in the world. All open to the elements, all just there in piece piles. And among those, in this strange system they developed, they saw that Vali had married someone else, which I sort of found romantically a little sad, even though my grandfather had married my grandmother, else I wouldn't be here. And the sister had come looking for them. But I didn't know what to do with any of that, so I set it all that aside. And instead what I decided to do was use her letters as a guide, both to the geographies that she'd walked, and there were many, and also to her experience, and to try to read her letters against the restrictions she was under. Because all of her letters are open, and so they're all in some way coded. She never fully shares with him what she's going through. They start in Vienna, and then she goes to Troppau, which is now called Opava in the Czech Republic. It was then Czechoslovakia. And then she moves on to Berlin. All of these things seem ridiculous to me. Why didn't she just go to America? But of course, I had to keep reminding myself that she didn't know what we knew. When she moves back to Czechoslovakia, it's because her mother is there alone. Her mother had raised her alone. And of course, Czechoslovakia was free. She had no idea that 6 months later it would be handed over to Germany with the Munich Agreement. Nobody did. But her town became virulently, aggressively, stridently, and proudly anti-Semitic upon being incorporated into the Reich. And so she moves to Berlin, which seemed to me also bizarre. But the fact was that she was anonymous in Berlin. She wasn't known as being a Jew. And this was a woman for whom her primary identity was a professional Western woman. She didn't know at the beginning of these letters if she particularly cared about the idea of marriage or children. What she wants is to be seen as a doctor. She wants to be seen as an intellectual. That's what she's been doing. And she writes to him mostly at first about the love affair. She says, I think of you when we work at the hospital the way you don't like. And every time I pass a newsstand where they sell entertainment journals, when I read something you would love, when I put on a dress you would like, whenever the word America is mentioned, when there's talk of love. She doesn't tell him that she's joined something called the kindergarten seminar, which is the only place left she can work at that point. But it is an amazing bastion of cultural fervency because no one can work anywhere else. So there are the leading musicologists and epidemiologists and theater directors teaching English, just teaching high school to girls in the last place they're allowed to teach. She's desperately trying to bring her mother with her. She's trying to get out, but she doesn't talk about that at all. And in fact, if anything, she's constantly trading the idea of obsessing over love, because in some ways it begins to stand for freedom to her. And she doesn't tell him that as 39 becomes 40, she's no longer allowed to buy clothes or shoes. And that when you're in the Reich, the restrictions start as a drip. It is not all at once. It's not what we think of as the Gestapo coming in and a raid and a roundup. It's not the Star. It's not Kristallnacht. It's not Auschwitz. It's a day-by-day untethering of normalcy, like an episode of Twilight Zone. But she writes to him and says, in the spring of 1940, "My beloved only one, my boy, you will be with me in this world." This one sentence stays with me all the time, wherever I am. I can hear it, see it, and feel it. Always your words, "you will be with me," are comfort and torture at the same time, because of the question, when? Please tell me, beloved, when? I don't know the answer, and the consulate has only a vague idea of 1 to 2 years, an eternity, unimaginable, inconceivable, equal to 100 years to me, who must be with you within the shortest imaginable period of time, right now and immediately. She doesn't tell him that partly that desire is fueled by the fact that at this point they're being forced into something called Judenhäuser. Apartments that once had housed maybe a couple, maybe a family, were now forced to host 10 or 15 or 20 people sleeping on the floor, cheek by jowl, as all of them go to their forced labor assignments. She doesn't tell him she's forced to move again and again, but he might have noticed that her letters are constantly in care of other people. She never really has her own place. But he does know that things are becoming more dire because a rabbi who got out that spring wrote to him, and he said, "For $150 apiece, you can get Vali and her mother out with illegal visas to Chile. They look very good. We've done it once, we think we can do it again. And you must, because the Jews of the town of Stettin, which was a Baltic seaport town, have been brutally and aggressively rounded up, and we fear this is a harbinger of what's to come." And so I thought, okay, you get it, 1940, $150 isn't ours, but still, round it up, get it together. Where is it? And so I looked into his files further, and I saw that among the letters, there were also dozens and dozens and dozens of canceled checks in tiny amounts, $20, $44, and they were from something called the National Committee for the Resettlement of Foreign Physicians. And so I looked into what that was and if they had any archives, and it turned out the Immigration Research Center at the University of Minnesota has their archives, scattered but somewhat together. It was recommended by a woman named Laurel Leff, who wrote a book about the New York Times and the Holocaust. Because the National Committee for the Resettlement of Foreign Physicians was working against the American Medical Association, which was actively lobbying state governments against licensing Jewish refugee physicians arriving from German-speaking countries. So state after state, by 1943, there were only 2 states left in the Union that would license a refugee before he'd been in the country for 5 years. And it turned out that though the myth of my family, in addition to having escaped with everyone, was that he had been an instant, immediate success, that he'd arrived exactly in the right time, it turned out in their files that they had kept a 50-page dossier on him by their social workers, which noted that by that spring, when he's being asked for $150 apiece, his mother has now sold the last of her jewelry, netting her $60, that he can't pay his $5 a week rent, that he is destitute. And he asks them for loans to start his practice, and they set him up in the far northwesternmost point of Massachusetts, in part because in some ways to battle the xenophobia of those who are against these physicians being licensed, the argument was to place them outside of city centers, to place them in places that might have more need. So he has no money. And time passes, and restrictions begin to line up. By the following spring, she is no longer allowed, in the course of that spring of 41, to buy meat or coffee or tea or eggs or jam. She's no longer allowed her bicycle or her typewriter. She will soon no longer be allowed on public transport if her work is less than 7 kilometers from where she lives. And she writes to him and she says, none of that. Instead, she says, a long, long time ago, you wrote to me from Vienna, when I was supposed to go to Prague, that one should not be so small-minded to sacrifice the present to the phantom of the future. You wrote these words in a completely different context at the time, but you were so right then. And maybe that's your thinking right now as well, and maybe you are right in not wanting to sacrifice your present either to the past or to the future. It is, however, so terribly sad for me, because I live almost without a present, and I can live only for the past and for the future. And in that letter she goes on and she says, all I need, though, from you at this point, because he'd given her an affidavit, her visa, her quota number had come due, all I need is passage on a ship. But what they don't know is that that summer the U.S. State Department decided there would be no more seats opened up. That in fact the U.S. State Department had ruled that if anyone had any family members they'd be leaving behind, they were potential fifth columnists. They told consulates to turn people away, that there were no more visas to be on offer. They told shipping companies not to add ships, not to add seats, and that in fact seats already sold would likely not be needed. And then in September she puts on the star. And then in October the German government decides that their policy of expulsion would be replaced by deportation and murder. All this has happened before that. And then her last letter comes to him and she's still begging him for visas to anywhere, to Cuba. Can he get her through Sweden? Can he do anything? And then we enter the war and her letters stop. And for a long time I thought, I walked these geographies, I saw these places, the French talk about the lieux de mémoire, these places of memory, and I thought, I will go to these places where she's been, I will see what she saw, I'll see what's there still. But still, her letters stop, and what happens? And so I stalled. I couldn't do it. I thought, I can't write this. I don't know what I'm going to do with this. There is no book to write. There is no more story to tell. I've come to the end. I will fail her again. I won't be able to do it. And at that point, an academic I'd met in my many travels who lives in Vienna, and he is a descendant, unlike me, of a victim. He's a descendant of the other side. And of course, I came across many, many, many third-generation descendants of bystanders, perpetrators, who grapple with this question from the other side of things. Who would I have been then? In the same way I had always wondered as a child, how would I have survived? I used to constantly think. How would I have survived? What would I have done? And on the flip side of it, there are those, of course, in Germany and Austria in particular, who wonder, who would I have been? Would I have saved someone? Would I have stood by? Would I have pretended it wasn't happening? Would I have been a part of this? It's impossible for us to know, and yet we all torture ourselves with this question, which is unanswerable. But in any case, he looked through some of the materials I had gathered from various archives, and he said, what happened to the person that came searching for her? Why didn't you pursue that line of thinking? I said, well, I did a bit of searching. Nothing came up, Google. He said, well, I think you could do better. I said, no, I know. And I looked, but I found no trace of this woman who wrote Looking for Molly from the early 50s until the early 60s. And he said, well, did you see that in page number, 200, she lists the years her children are born in one of these files when she files requests for information, she gives some biographical information. She doesn't say their names, but she says they were born in 39 and 42 or 44 and 46. Maybe you should be looking for them. And so I went back to my papers and I thought, of course he was right, but I thought how to go about looking for people. Did they have the same name? Where did they live? Were they in the UK still? She was writing from London. And so I decided to go back to the time before all of our digital crutches and do what people did after the war, which was to place classified ads. People placed classified ads in these newsletters for survivors. In the US, we had the Aufbau, which means reconstruction, and in my grandparents' house, on the dining room table, or rather the coffee table in the living room, there was always the Aufbau and the New England Journal of Medicine, two most essential pieces of literature. And in the UK, they had the Association for Jewish Refugees Journal. And right after the war, At first there were search notices, the way people did after 9/11 in New York. And then, similarly, it became death notices. There's still notices in the Association for Jewish Refugees Journal in London. Mostly they're things like the Kristallnacht ceremony will be held on this date at this place. Well, often they're death notices, later death notices now. And it was there I placed this ad asking for information if anyone knew anything about my searcher and about, or perhaps about any of her children. I placed the ad and then I sort of forgot about it. I thought, this won't work. Nobody reads classified ads anymore. And a couple months passed and I went to London on a totally different assignment for a conference. And I begged the conference to let me stay an extra night because you go to these conferences and, you know, you fly a long way, but you could be in Cincinnati because the room could be anywhere. And they agreed to let me stay an extra night in town. So I went to the Tate, did some London things, and then came home back to my hotel in between the Tate and dinner. And I got an email from a woman saying, imagine my emotion. I'm the youngest daughter of the searcher. I think I have the information you're looking for. I don't know if you're ever in London. So I said, I'm here till 4 o'clock tomorrow, call me. But she hadn't left her phone number. But I'll open it up to questions.
I wanted to ask you which archives you used for the information about the consulates refusing visas in the United States.
Those are from the FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act requests of Richard Brightman at American University. His books on McDonald and the kind of arguments between the State Department. There's several books. If you look in the back of my book, you'll see there's like relatively detailed, not bibliography, well, bibliography per chapter. And I can tell you, that's if you want, James G. McDonald, and the book is Refugees and Rescue, the Diaries and Papers of James G. McDonald, 1935 to 1945. I did look at EVO a bit. I used Leo Back Institute, which is where EVO is held. The Immigration Research Center archives in the University of Minnesota, the archives of the Centrum Judaicum in Berlin, the General State Archives of Berlin, the archives of the indemnity requests of Berlin, of Germany rather, the National State Archives of Austria, the archives of Opava, Czechoslovakia, as well as the International Tracing Service, and then the Holocaust Museum itself, which has a lot of archives, like that have been gathered. They've sort of done an ingathering of archives there, if that makes sense. So they are now the repository of much of that information from ITS, the International Tracing Service. I don't know if that's helpful. But you know, it really depends on the geography of the person you're looking for, if that's what you're asking. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How many letters were there? And were you able to, did your grandfather write her back? Was he able to?
There were a few dozen letters, and I have one draft of a letter that he replied to. And he often in her letters she's frustrated. She feels he's not answering fast enough. She feels he's not answering at all. And in fact, a lot of my readers have been frustrated with him on her behalf. And it's very hard for me to know how much he responded and how much was lost and how much got through and when he replied and when he didn't. And I think some of it, I mean, my supposition going through the material on what was happening for him is that things were quite dire for him for those first 2 years in the US. And either between his own reticence or maybe even embarrassment about that and his own kind of scrambling to gain purchase in the United States, he is not fast enough. He's not fast enough to reply to her. Though he does offer, I mean, there is a back and forth between him and her uncle, who's already in the US, about gathering that money for the $150. And the uncle finally writing him, I don't know what my grandfather writes, but I have the response from the uncle saying, there's nothing you can add to this. I didn't quite realize your situation. And so it's clear that they're discussing things. And there's all sorts of other sort of back chatter between other people around what can be done for her. Have you heard from her? You know, for example, a woman writes to him from the UK in 39 saying, I've gotten her a position as a mother's helper. And then Germany invades Poland, and I'm sorry that's now disappeared. And she had written to him you can sort of cross-reference between the letters, and she'd written to him saying, I had an opportunity, it's past, but I'm not going to let it weigh me down. She doesn't realize that this may have been her best. And at first it doesn't seem to be to her, perhaps, in part because at first she really wants to be a doctor somewhere. I mean, she doesn't actually want to go and be a maid in someone's home, which are some of the opportunities, but she more and more realizes that that's what she could take, and then the doors are closing because war is creeping everywhere. And partly, you know, she starts out very late. She starts very late looking for things because they delayed during the time between her leaving Vienna, which she finished her degree 4 days before Anschluss, 4 days before Hitler invades. So she holds one of the last degrees in hand that a Jew can hold, and she waits for that, and then goes home to her mother, and then I suspect, although I don't have absolute assurance, that she waits until the Sudetenland is handed to Hitler, and all of a sudden then, like everyone else, they try to scramble to get onto that quota. And by then, she's told she's a 2-year wait. And part of the problem was this: he was very, very, very prescient about getting on a list, getting on. I mean, he got on the line the second things started. And she delayed in part because I think, and this was true of a lot of women, many women stayed behind for their mothers. And in fact, there are more women left in these areas of Berlin and Vienna and the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia than there were men. And she writes to him at some point, do you know there are only women here now? In part because the brutality was really aimed at men at first. And so there was a big push to get husbands and brothers out. And so, for example, I interviewed people who had a father sent to the UK, but the mother and daughter stayed behind, thinking, we'll wait this out and we'll get ourselves there eventually, and then they're trapped. Because there was a sense, because after Kristallnacht also especially, mostly men were rounded up and taken to places like Dachau. And so there was a sense the dire need was immediately met.
I'm wondering if you see any parallels with today.
I do actually wrote an essay about this recently. I don't have a prescription for today, but I think that the difference, what I've been thinking about a lot with the current refugee crisis, if that's what you're asking about, is...
No, it goes beyond that, and the drift to the right, aggravated by the refugee crisis.
Well, I guess there's sort of two thoughts about this. One, I have many thoughts about it. My initial thought, watching as the kind of massive refugee crisis unfolded, and of course the refugee crisis has been going on for many years. It's only now that this flood has, sort of really begun. But I mean, going back to, to mid-2000s, you were having people washing up on shores, and there's kind of questions. I was living in Madrid, and there were people washing up on tourist beaches, and all sorts of debates about it, but in very minor ways. How was Frontex couldn't handle this, things like that. We're now seeing it because of the flood. And I think that this speaks to also some of the ways in which people discussed refugees then, and the case that was made for many, many years during and after the war for plausible deniability. There was a long sort of sense of, well, we don't really know what's happening, we're not really seeing this, and even after the war you have decades and decades of books coming out about when did Roosevelt know what, when did Churchill know what, when did the BBC report, murder, when did the New York Times report gas, and there's always this debate about what was happening and who knew and who had eyes on the ground. And I think the biggest difference today is that there is no plausible deniability. The human rights crisis, the human calamity is taking place, and we will be tasked with knowing that we had this moral burden from the moment it began. And what we do with it, we can never say that we didn't know. I don't have a good prescription for it because, first of all, the tide seems unending, and we have obviously not addressed the Syrian crisis, which has been, which is sort of a major pushing point. 4.5 years of major conflict and displacing 4 million people with no end in sight is a different story too. I think one of the things people often ask me about, people ask me a lot about current, let's say, anti-Semitism today and things like that. I think one of my concerns with using this book, as a prescriptive is that we need different tools. It's not the same crisis. When we think about things like the refugee crisis today, it's not the same crisis. We need different tools, but we have to recognize that we're seeing it in the current sort of media saturated environment. I don't know if that answers.
In your research, did you come across any insights as to why the Jews in Vienna seemed so oblivious to what had been happening next door in Germany for
They
all
weren't
those years?
oblivious. They weren't remotely oblivious. But, you know, first of all, they were watching it carefully. They were concerned about it. They'd all been talking about leaving for some time. The Jews of Vienna were actually among the most successful to immigrate. Of percentage-wise, more Viennese Jews got out than others. And many of them were waiting to have things in hand like a degree. They felt that they needed a degree in order to get into America and be able to be successful. And if anything, actually, it was not obliviousness, it was more of a question of how to navigate the quota system, how to get an affidavit, how to have someone vouch for you in the United States. It wasn't that easy to get into the United States. It was really about not having purchase in other places more than anything else. And there's a chart that's now part of the permanent exhibit at the Holocaust Museum in Washington that was created by the Jewish community of Vienna itself. And it shows every single step of the way that a Jew had to go through in order to get an exit visa. You had to have stamps from dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of offices. And they had to be time-stamped so that if you started and finished outside of a 2-week period, you had to start again. So it was not obliviousness, it was the sheer impossibility of it. I mean, I think that that's not a fair characterization. There was a waiting to some degree, but in part also, I mean, look at the Syrian crisis. I mean, again, and I just said I wasn't gonna go back to it yet, but you know, it's taken 4.5 years for this flood to really show up on Europe's doorstep. The conflict's been going on for a lot longer than that. It takes a long time for people to feel the better option is the total unknown in a country where you don't speak the language, where you have no job, where you may have no support system. It takes a long time for people to feel that way. And the thing was, up until the moment of Anschluss, Jews of Vienna had every right. Then overnight, within 6 weeks, every restriction that had been imposed from 33 to 38 was imposed on the Jews of Vienna. And so there was no question what was coming. And so in fact, that's what spurred so many of them to leave, because the Viennese and the Austrians in general kind of, you know, rallied to the cause of Nazism very quickly. There was a Nazi party that was in the 20s that was made illegal. And in fact, in the early 30s, it was incredibly anti-Semitic on the campus of the University of Vienna. One of the things I get into in the book was that my grandfather's myth of the perfect Vienna was never true. There was never this perfect Vienna of which he had always waxed on about and returned to every other year after 1950 to study in. From 1930 to 34-ish, when Austro-fascism comes in, the interwar years in Austria are really complicated politically. There was a strong Nazi faction on campus, and there was no police presence because of a belief in free university that would not allow police presence on campus. So Jewish men knew that they would be beaten and beaten often. And there were Jews studying from Jews and Nazis studying from Nazis, and then a handful of people in between. And so there was aggressive anti-Semitism on campus that had a Nazi element to it of thuggery. But most people believed that Austria was a little more aligned with Italian fascism versus German fascism, and they kind of hoped it would go in that direction. And that's, I mean, it's complicated though to look at the different fascisms. At this point, it's much easier to sort of think of it as one thing, but it wasn't. And, you know, Italian fascism seemed to them to be a lesser evil to some degree. I mean, in retrospect, they didn't think so, but at the time they thought, well, that won't be as anti-Semitic. I mean, I think that was the prevailing feeling because, but, you know, of course, I'm also not in their head. But, you know, so again, I get back to this question of what propels you to go to a country where you don't speak the language, where you have no support system, where you have to do everything you can to get into it and you don't know if you'll survive there. I mean, there are stories of people who had exit visas ready and they were about to leave for Shanghai and they turned back because they'd been getting word back that Shanghai was oppressive and awful and a terrible place to live. And then they're murdered later, you know, so then Shanghai, of course, relatively seems better. But it's very hard to know that. And remember, this is not just young people, you know, it's people of all ages. And many people felt, especially older people, but I don't mean even older, I mean, my age and up, felt that it would be very, very hard to start again somewhere else in a language they didn't speak, in a place where they wouldn't be able to work. What would it mean? They had relatively nice lives. It was very hard to know. I think we often impose, and I go back to the phrase I used at the beginning, we don't recognize the incremental knowledge. They didn't know what we know. Things happened day by day. It was not all at once until it was all at once. And I think it's really, very important to look at that. And you see it in the letters, the sort of incremental increase of anxiety and the revise that creeps in. It doesn't happen until it's too late.
The way you describe it, the letters were very private between the two of them, and your grandfather didn't talk about it all his life. What do you think would have been his opinion about you doing this and writing a book about it?
Knowing him, on some level, I think he'd be happy to still be being spoken of. But, I don't know. I've thought about, people ask me this a lot. Most of the people ask me if my grandmother would be upset. They both are no longer with us. I do think they're very private. It took me a long time to kind of come to terms with what to do with it. But ultimately, I decided that the greater good was not allowing the erasure, and that the greater good was to tell a story of an individual and sort of restore the dignity of individuality to one woman who was remarkable in the way that we're all remarkable, without necessarily having left a mark, insofar as we don't argue about her at Sotheby's because she didn't own a Renoir, and we haven't read her diary because she didn't leave one. To me, it felt a tactile way of relating to the period, and that her words and her letters are so beautiful that to let them sit in a box would do no one any good. But I certainly grappled with it. And not everybody thinks I made the right choice. But I don't know. That's for you to decide, really. I made the choice to publish them, so obviously I thought the better option was to tell her story and allow her story to be told.
What kind of credentials did you need to be able to gain access to these archives?
Pugnacity. It's just, no, I was gonna say tenaciousness. I don't know, the hardest one was ITS and the International Tracing Service. You can go, I applied, I said I was a journalist, which I am. I did this originally as a 5-part series for Slate about the sort of idea of archive, what's in archive, what can an archive offer a normal person, and using Bali as a kind of subtext to that, but particularly about these closed archives. I found that a lot of these researchers were actually really interested in helping me, because so often this material is so enormous that if you can tell a single person's story through these endless hallways, that it allows the archives to be a living memorial in a way that they're often not. And so I actually found mostly open doors. The bigger question was not about credentials. It was more about how to know how to ask the right questions of the material, because I often found I didn't really know what I was looking for. I showed up, for example, in the archives in Opava, which was the town of Troppau when she lived in it. And I get there after this many day journey. It's almost at the border of Poland. It's not. It used to be a capital of what was called Silesia at the time. It had some beautiful opera house actually that was designed by Schikaneder. I get there and I realize I haven't prepared. I don't actually know what I'm looking to find there. I sort of want to find evidence of them, which is really very vague. And the archivist is kind of horrified by how little I prepared. And then we start kind of going over what the options are, and all of a sudden he comes up with the fact that he can show me the Aryanization papers of Bali's mother, which is the defrauding of the family of everything they had built over the course of 30 years on pages and pages and pages, where she signs away her right to everything she's ever earned and everything she's ever owned because of the law of citizenship XYZ number. And I know I'm no longer allowed to have this because I'm a Jewess signature. And that was extremely profound, but I felt like, oh my God, amazing that this wasn't a wasted trip, because and even with the International Tracing Service, which I'm super prepared for, I ultimately, the man that Bali marries, I realized at some point I discovered he was working for Siemens. And I wrote to ITS again, I said, gee, the man she marries is working for Siemens. It's so odd you didn't have a work card for him, because there's work cards stored there too. He said, well, you didn't ask for the work card. So, you have to know what you're looking for. That's the hardest thing. Archives are not, they're not necessarily indexed in a way that is obvious. They're not necessarily they're opaque in terms of, you have to, and sometimes you have to return again and again. That was the bigger question. And then kind of create relationships with the archivists and hope they will have patience.
Did she take her husband's name? Did that complicate things?
She did, but I did find that in the in that initial foray at the International Tracing Service. She did take his name. And the other piece of problem was that because intake was often taken by prisoners who were not necessarily German, sometimes they changed spellings to fit the country they had come from. So there are something like 850 ways to write Schwartz at the International Tracing Service, based on whether or not it was a Frenchman or a Pole or a Czech or a German who wrote it down, or come up with anything else. And so that was complicating because you had to sort of find out have them look for you and see if there were any other potential spellings of names, and that might open things up. But yeah, let me wrap it up, and let me tell you one last thing as I do, which is that my grandfather lived his whole life, and partly going back to your question, with a sense of great joy. And in fact, I think that he would have been surprised to some degree by how burdened I am by the past, because he tried his whole life not to be. And he lived with a kind of sense of presence of moment that we sort of talk about in yoga classes now, but he did it naturally. And I just thought I'd close by reading you a tiny sliver of a letter he wrote to his best friend from school in Vienna in 1986, where he says, "My dear Bruno, my question remains, does unlimited freedom to come and to go, to stay or leave, to attend or ignore, to eat or to starve, to read or to dream, create a vacuum, or is it paradise at last?" He tells him he's gone out on a boat on a lake, and he had this amazing experience. "There was an exhilarating sense of self in this wide world, a self I used to know, a marvelous antidote to deadening routine. We have to stop racing in all that it implies, that there is a future, that tomorrow is more important than today. We have to assign overwhelming importance to the day and to our act, our performance on this day. We have to summon our accumulated experience and our accumulated resources to fashion a day that we can live with Zukin delight. Please try." Thank you.
Thank you.